Hello, hello, and welcome back to Retrieving Sanity with your podcast host Keegan, and this is your podcast for all mental health, addiction, recovery issues, and topics. And today we have a very special guest, and his name is Dr. Scott Bonn. Hello, sir. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
So, you're a criminologist, correct?
That is correct.
And what exactly does a criminologist do?
Well, I am trained in primarily in sociology,
Okay.
and sociology is the study of factors that influence society. And in this case, we're talking about crime. So I look at the drivers, the things that lead to crime in a community or in a society in the United States, and how crime affects the community and affects the population. So it's both on the sort of the causal side, like what are the things that cause crime, what are the things that cause murder, and then what are the effects of these things on our society.
Oh, okay. Very interesting. I'm sure that's led you down some interesting rabbit holes through the years, right?
Absolutely, absolutely, and I have it's kind of an interesting background because I've really been only in this field for about the last 25 years, and prior to that, for nearly 20 years, I actually worked in the advertising and media and entertainment fields, and primarily working with news organizations like NBC News, and it was my work there that led me to really fully understand how a crime story can captivate a society, and there's pros and cons to that because we can learn from these stories, but then the dark side of it is sometimes the perpetrator becomes what I like to call a celebrity monster in our society, and the focus is so much on this individual that we lose sight of the crimes that they did, the harm that they did to the victims and to society in general. And so I'm talking about things, in particular, a serial killer like a Ted Bundy or a John Wayne Gacy, who killed more than 30 people each, and yet no one seems to really remember the name of any of the victims, but yet everybody knows who Ted Bundy is. And so I brought that understanding and that perspective into my work now as a criminologist. And so I spend a lot of time debunking myths about crime and stereotypes. I try to educate, inform, and make people aware of the realities of crime and how these things really affect us.
Very interesting. And I know that you just mentioned some of the serial killers, the real famous ones, and you actually have a book out, and you're doing a one-man show. Is it about the book? And your book is Serial Killers. Let me pull up the title. I already forgot. I'm bad with names.
It's why we love serial killers: the curious appeal of the world's most savage murderers.
There we go.
And yes, thank you for mentioning both the book and my the one man show that I do now around the country. The two are related, but they're all also a bit separate, and I'll explain what I mean.
Okay.
So, nearly 20 years ago now, when I was teaching in the classroom for the first time, I began to realize that when you mention the word serial killer, some people just get so excited and so enthusiastic, because these individuals like the John Wayne Gacy's and the Ted Bundys and the Jeffrey Dahmers have become like cultural icons. They're almost like lightning rods, and they get people very excited when you talk about them. And I just found this so curious. Like, why are we drawn to these macabre, terrible individuals? And that's what led me, like you mentioned, a rabbit hole, kind of led me down the rabbit hole some years ago. And I began doing research, and I began trying to understand this phenomenon. Why are we drawn to them, almost like moths to a flame? And that led me to write this book, which has the very ironic title, Why We Love Serial Killers. And yet I've had people say just that. I've had people say it's like a guilty pleasure. It's like eating a pint of Haagen-Dazs in bed at 3 o'clock in the morning. It's this guilty pleasure. And then over the years, I kind of went back to my entertainment roots. I mentioned, I started out sort of in the entertainment field, and I had more and more invitations to do public speaking. And so I have now developed this show that I take around the country, and it's called Serial Killers with Dr. Scott Bonn. And basically, what it is a 90-minute exploration of the serial killer mind, the pathological mind, through my eyes and through my work and through my interviews and actual correspondence and interactions with many of these, very heinous individuals. And it is dark. It is scary. I hope it's educational and enlightening. It's also a bit shocking and chilling, but it's also entertaining, because when you have a topic like this, you almost can't help to have a little dark humor along the way. It just seems like it's part of the freight, or part of what goes with it. So it's an exciting 90 minutes, and it's entertaining and a little scary too.
Oh man, that sounds really interesting. I wish you were actually doing something here in Texas, because that would be.
Well, I was in Texas last year, and I'm hoping to come back again fairly soon. I was in actually Austin and Houston and Dallas last year,
Oh man,
and if things go right, hopefully I'll be back there again in the not too distant future.
I hope so, because I'll definitely catch you then. And you'd mentioned something about the dark humor. I think that that's kind of what society needs whenever we discuss such dark topics, because it kind of brings the humanity back,
Yes.
in a sense, to where it's like, yeah, there's bad things that happen, but there's always a little bit of a twist on it. Do you think that that's something that is like ingrained in people?
Yeah, well, you can't sustain the tension. I mean, like, if you think about even the greatest horror movies, always have like that, that a little bit of humor, because you can't sustain that tension and that anxiety over a lengthy period of time. It becomes debilitating. So I think it's almost the same here. It's a cathartic release. It's like, for a moment I can breathe, and I can get it out, because you just can't sustain that tension forever. And then also, I think some of it has to do with the absurdity, or the unbelievable nature of it all. Sometimes things are funny just because they're so extreme and so abstract and so unreal. You can't imagine that they're actually happening. And I think it's the same case here, because when you look at these individuals and the things that they do, it's just so over the top, unprecedented. For many of us, it's just hard to even wrap our minds around it, that we need almost like a release sometimes, a catharsis, just to let it out.
Mm-hmm. So, what really got you into the serial killers? Like, you kind of mentioned the guilty pleasure for people or society as a whole. What is it that
Yeah.
brought you into really diving down this big rabbit hole?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a great question, and again, I think it has to do with somewhat with my background and my training, in, as I said, in media and advertising, and working in the news media, because it was there that I noticed that certain cases. And so, for example, I was at NBC when the OJ Simpson case took off, and I saw how it just captivated the world, and not only captivated the world, but divided the world.
Mm-hmm.
And also the Menendez brothers. That's another one that people may recall. And Johnny Versace. I was actually down in Miami when Johnny Versace was shot. And
Oh,
certain
wow.
cases just captivate. And as I mentioned before, it's in those cases in particular where sometimes it's the perpetrator who becomes the focus of attention, which in my mind is wrong. The focus of attention should be on the harm done, and the victims, and the victims' families, and the people who are, really have to put the pieces back together.
Mm-hmm.
And we should not create these celebrity monsters, is what is a term that I coined, because I think it sort of, it expresses, or it demonstrates what I'm talking about. They're these monstrous individuals in terms of, ghouls, but yet they become celebrities. So they're not just celebrities, and they're not just monsters. They're celebrity monsters. And so, why the serial killers? Well, Partially, once again, because my students in the classroom, anytime I said the word serial killer or mentioned Ted Bundy or Jeffrey Dahmer, you would have thought that I hit them with a cattle prod. They got, they jumped. They were so excited, in the classroom. Partially that, and then partially also, I thought to myself, who is the epitome of this sort of macabre sensationalism and attention, that we give? It would be the serial killers. These are the individuals that seem to get, bask in this glow of macabre, fascination. So I went to the extreme. I mean, because if you think about it, you take a Jeffrey Dahmer, right?
Yeah.
A Jeffrey Dahmer who preyed upon these individuals, he abducted them, he sexually assaulted them, he tortured them, he killed them, he dismembered them, and in some cases, he ate them. And if you think about that, what is left that you could possibly do to another human being? That's about as bad as it gets.
Mm-hmm.
And so they really exemplify the absolute extreme of what one human being can do to defile and hurt another person. So I said to myself, what's better? What better subject to try to understand, and then at the same time try to understand our curious, macabre fascination with all of this. So
Mm-hmm.
that's what led me, into this.
Wow. You had said something about celebrity monsters, and
Yes.
so isn't it true that a lot of serial killers or people that go on terror rampages are looking for that notoriety, that are looking for that in particular?
Yeah, and in fact, some of the most well-known serial killers, and so like David Berkowitz, the son of Sam, who I have extensively interviewed and actually spent time with, visiting him in prison. John Wayne Gacy. There's another pretty infamous individual. His name is Dennis Rader. He gave himself the name Bind, Torture, Kill (BTK). These were real attention-seeking individuals, who are definitely profound psychopaths, and what's known as, and I'm sure you're familiar with the term, malignant narcissist. So these are individuals who definitely manifest narcissism, but a particular type where they're actually sadists. In addition to that, so that's a pretty, a malignant narcissist and psychopath together. That's a pretty dangerous combination. You don't want to mess with an individual like that. But what comes along with it, oftentimes, is this grandiosity where they need to have attention for what they're doing. It's not enough to do it. They want the world to know about it, and they want to be recognized for it. Now, it's important to say that, and I actually talk about this in my show, there's this common myth, that serial killers are all the same, and that's just not the case. There's all varieties: gender, sexual orientation, race, ethnicity, education, IQ, social status. I mean, they come in all varieties. But what the underlying connection is that killing strangers serves some psychological hunger and need, and actually like a fantasy need that they have. And then some of them do have this grandiosity and need for attention. Not all of them, but I would say, if I had to give an estimate, and it's hard, to categorize exactly,
Mm-hmm.
but probably somewhere at least a third, maybe 40% of them do fall into that category.
Oh
Some
wow.
of them don't have that need, but of course it's interesting because it's why we know them. So the
Mm-hmm.
ones that crave this notoriety, crave this attention and headlines in the media, are often the ones that we know the best, because they got what they wanted. They got the attention that they were seeking.
Oh man, so it's almost like a negative feedback loop, like, or a self-fulfilling prophecy of sorts in the weirdest way.
Yes, exactly, exactly. That's right. And it became, and people have said to me, even critics, and I welcome criticism, but don't you see that you're feeding the need for attention just by corresponding with these individuals and talking to them, and interviewing them? And I do realize that. I mean, I do see that, that they crave that attention. So when they hear that a professor, wants to talk to them or whatever, to a certain extent, that could be appealing, and feeding their ego. But at the same time, I try not to approach it from the standpoint just gratuitous uh, uh, um, attention, but rather use them as a source, an
Hmm.
interview source, like you would interview anyone else, or as a law enforcement official would interview someone, as a source. And I believe that the attention that I may give or have given them, hopefully, is offset by what I learn and what I've been able to contribute to society and to education in terms of understanding these individuals.
Yeah, and that's kind of what I was just about to say. Whenever you brought up the critics talking about feeding their ego, well, I mean, yeah, but they're already incarcerated. There's not much more that they can do, um, and
That is true. That is true.
so
Uh,
there's that. But oh, sorry, go ahead.
no, I was just going to say, it's interesting how they change. Like a BTK,
Hmm.
he's a classic example, and once again narcissist, psychopath. Does not is incapable of normal emotional connection and empathy as we might know it, and so for him, he lives in this 8 by 10 cell, and he's locked in there 23 hours a day by himself, and the 1 hour a day that he's allowed out in the courtyard, he's accompanied by a guard with a gun. So he has virtually no human interaction. And now, for most of us, that would be a debilitating thing, perhaps even a fatal thing. We just wouldn't be able to survive it for very long. Well, he's able to not only survive it, but in some ways enjoy it, because he fills his time up with other forms of fantasy and other forms of interest, that things that just amuse him, and he does love to correspond with people, because it gives him the opportunity to be the celebrity, so it was not lost on me that when I was corresponding with him, it was kind of like in Silence of the Lambs, Hannibal Lecter and Clarice Starling. You had a little bit of that going on,
Uh-huh.
because he definitely feels he's the great man,
Mm.
the genius who's going to share his pearls of wisdom, with me. But I would just sort of deflect any time that he was trying to gratuitously get feed his ego. I would just sort of deflect it and just keep to the our discussion, keep to the matter at hand. And but so my point being is that these individuals are able to survive in an isolated environment like that in ways that some of us probably can't understand, and probably would never be able to do, and myself included. But these individuals, because they have other forms of satisfaction and other forms of fulfillment, that they don't necessarily even need human interaction.
That's very interesting. It almost sounds like he thrives in that kind of environment.
Yeah, he has up until lately, when his health his health is really failing now. But prior to that, I think he really did enjoy it. I mean, this is going a little bit deeper into him, but he calls his little 8 by 10 cell the cave. And what he has done is he's even created a logo for himself. He's taken the name, his name Dennis,
Uh-huh.
taken the D, put it on its back, so it looks kind of like a cave, the opening of a cave,
Uh-huh.
and he's created letterhead from himself,
Huh.
and it comes to you as a cave, CAVE missive, right? So it's like a letter to you from the cave. And he would tell me, this was back when his health was a lot better. He would
Mm.
say, things are thriving in the cave. We're very busy. We're this season we're very busy. Like he's almost like he's running a business or something out of his solitary confinement cell. So
Oh
yeah,
man.
he was. I mean, to your point, is up until his health got bad, I think he really was thriving in his own little world there.
That's really interesting that someone can be in that position and thrive, because being humans, we're social creatures.
Yeah, yeah. Well, he does not. That's the interesting thing about about a psychopath and a narcissist like that. He loves the attention, but yet he's as far as I'm concerned, is just incapable of normal emotion and feelings and empathy the way you and I know it. And one of the leading FBI profilers who I got to know very well, his name was Roy Hazelwood. He's one of the few individuals who really pioneered modern day criminal profiling, and he interviewed them all. He interviewed Bundy, he interviewed Dahmer, you name it, and he said without a doubt the most stone cold psychopath who has given him chills more than any other is Dennis Rader, and so he finds satisfaction for himself in a way that I think is just hard for most of us to even understand or comprehend.
Hmm. So being antisocial and him being such a big narcissist, isn't narcissism really just a big antisocial personality trait or disorder?
It, yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And you brought up a really, really important point because in my show, people will say to me, Scott, these individuals, they have to just be, clinically insane. And when I tell them, no, actually they're not, according to the DSM-5 and according to, the American Psychiatric Association, the vast majority of them, probably 80%, would not be considered clinically mentally ill because they fall into those categories: sociopath, narcissist, psychopath, and as such, they have these conditions, antisocial personality disorders, but they're not mentally ill. And the response I get from a lot of people is, "Come on, they got to be crazy." And I said, "Well, yeah, I understand. I do understand your point, but clinically, they are not,
Hmm.
and moreover, legally, they are not." And that is also a really important distinction
Hmm.
because in order the way our legal system works, and I'm just going to explain it. I'm not saying I necessarily agree with all this,
Uh-huh.
but the way it works is this: is in order for you to use the insanity defense on your behalf and in trial, the burden is on your lawyer as opposed to the burden of proof being on the state. In this case, it flips around, and the burden of proof is on your lawyer to demonstrate that you were mentally ill, incapable of understanding the difference between right and wrong, incapable of understanding that murder was wrong at the exact moment that you killed. Not 5 minutes before, not 5 minutes after, that exact moment. That's a very difficult thing to do. It's a
Yeah.
very difficult thing to do. And moreover, it doesn't even apply to these individuals because they have these antisocial personality disorders. They know that it's wrong to kill. They just don't care. Nothing will inhibit them. Nothing will deter them from killing. So that's why most serial killers don't even have the opportunity to use an insanity defense because it just doesn't apply.
Yeah. And so since they are clinically defined as such, they, like you said, they know what's right from wrong, and they just don't care. And so, uh, I've heard, like, of course, just from normal people, just a psychopath is crazy, absolutely out there, right? And then we also hear about sociopaths. What is the biggest distinction between the two, in your opinion?
Oh, fantastic, fantastic question. And I get this all the time. Fortunately, psychopaths are much more rare than sociopaths. And the reason I say fortunately is because they're the most extreme and they're also the most dangerous of all of the different antisocial personality disorders.
Mm.
Psychopathy is the most potentially dangerous. Not that all psychopaths are violent, and certainly not all psychopaths are serial killers, but they are, if one of them is most dangerous and most likely to be violent,
Mm.
or to be dangerous, I should say, is a psychopath. Now here's the distinction between a psychopath and a sociopath, and I'm going to speak to you. I am not a psychiatrist or a psychologist. I'm a criminologist. I'm trained, as I said, in criminology. But here's the way I understand it. Here's how I try to explain it to the layman. So, and this gets to the nature versus nurture debate.
Mm. That's a big
There's
one.
often the debate: are they born that way, or are they conditioned or socialized into it? And in the case of a psychopath is a function of nature. They are born that way. They are simply at birth hardwired differently their brain to in terms of impulse control, in terms of stimuli, in terms of how they process information and data. They're just different. And in particular, when it comes to impulse control, it's been shown that the frontal lobe of the brain, which controls impulses in a normal brain, is almost non existent in a psychopath. So there's no guardrails, there's no brakes. When they want to do something, they just do it.
Huh.
And when it comes, yeah, absolutely. And you know, they looked at the electrical movement and energy, you know, inside of the brain. And in the case of the psychopath, the frontal lobe is almost dead. There's just no activity there, whereas it would be fired up in the, you know, in a normal brain.
Huh.
Now, here's the thing. When it comes to emotional connection, empathetic connection, that thing that, you know, between us and other people and even other living things, is just non-existent in the case of a psychopath. They're biologically incapable at birth. And here's where I like to use an analogy of an electronic appliance like a hairdryer. If you have a hairdryer and you pull that cord out of the wall, it just doesn't work, right?
Yep.
When it comes to a psychopathic brain and the ability to connect with another human being, that plug is pulled. It just doesn't happen.
Huh.
They can mimic affect. And often then many of them become chameleons. They learn how to mimic the appropriate emotional response and affect, but they don't really feel it. And that's why, and in the extreme case, like a Ted Bundy or a BTK, when they become a serial killer, it means nothing to them. They just can't feel it. They can't. They are incapable of that empathetic connection. Which and they take it even further in order to neutralize their own guilt, in order to rationalize. They will even dehumanize another human being in order to absolve themselves of any responsibility. And what I mean by that is BTK referred to his victims not as victims or even human beings. They were projects. These were interesting projects that he worked on. So it's almost like, you know, this was his hobby and he was tinkering with birdhouses or something. You know, they weren't human beings. And Ted Bundy took it even further. He called them objects. He completely dehumanized them. These were not women. These were not living people. They were objects. So this is a common pattern, once again, to just neutralize it and just say, no, these aren't even people. You know, John Wayne Gacy, who had homosexual tendencies of his own, but yet turned on and actually would prey upon young men, runaways who were homosexuals. And the way he rationalized it is he said, I'm ridding the world of worthless punks and queers. These are his exact quote: worthless punks and queers. So he actually turned it around and used it as a rationalization for killing these individuals. Now, that's a psychopath.
Mm-hmm.
A sociopath is different. A sociopath is a person who's born with a normal functioning human brain, but here they are a function of nurture or socialization, hence the term sociopath. They're socialized into it. And oftentimes, how are they socialized into it? It's through a life of trauma, abuse, torture, torment themselves. And this becomes almost like a survival instinct. They become predators themselves to simply survive. And now these individuals, interestingly, because they are capable of empathetic connection under certain circumstances and with certain people, but not others, will actually have very volatile personalities. Unlike psychopaths that are just sort of unflappable, unmoving, Sociopaths tend to have these bouts of rage and anger and volatile emotions, which on the one hand makes them easier to detect. You can identify them more easily when you encounter one.
Hmm.
But as I said, they're almost also more common because they are born with a brain that is, functions more normally. And a classic example of a sociopathic serial killer, some of your audience may be familiar with Eileen Wuornos, a female serial killer. She was portrayed by Charlize Theron in the movie Monster some years ago. She actually won the Academy Award for it. Chilling performance and really on the money. I mean, she was incredible. And if you watch that film, or you can actually Google Eileen Wuornos and look for interviews, she's just raging, almost foaming at the mouth. She's so angry and so volatile. And then compare and contrast that to a Ted Bundy interview, which you can also Google, and there's just nothing there. He's just completely detached and unemotional.
Huh.
So yeah, so nature versus nurture, and that comprise probably, and then you throw narcissists in there as well, and it's oftentimes not, are you a narcissist or are you a psychopath? It's oftentimes you are a narcissist and a psychopath, so
Mm.
the two often come together, like BTK and Ted Bundy, definitely both psychopaths and and narcissists. Now, the remaining minority of serial killers, say 20% or so of serial killers who, and my dog Maggie just poked her head in there. She said hello. She's not a psychopath, I assure you. um, there is a realm, there is a small percentage of serial killers who actually are truly mentally ill. It would be paranoid schizophrenics, with psychotic delusions, etc. But it's the minority of serial killers, and the reason it's the minority of serial killers is because those individuals who are truly that mentally ill tend to leave evidence behind. They're
Mm.
disorganized. They're not so careful in what they do. They're easier to apprehend. The serial killers who get away with it for a long period of time and are able to kill 5, 10, 20, 30 people are the truly cold-blooded psychopathic individuals who are unruffled, unrattled, have no remorse, fear, guilt, shame, even fear, and therefore they tend to make fewer mistakes.
Huh.
They plan very well. They have escape patterns. They have all the contingencies covered, and that's why they get away with it. Not because they're so brilliant. That's another myth that all serial killers are these Hannibal Lecter evil geniuses. They're
Hmm.
not all evil geniuses, but they because they're psychopaths, they tend just to be so unemotional that they don't make a lot of mistakes.
Wow. Uh, I know myself. Normally hear the term serial killer, and I know that everyone is different, like as a human being. But we seem to, as a society, lump serial killers in one whole lump. Like you are a serial killer, and so this is what you are defined as and by. But you just
Yeah,
broke a barrier right there, because now it shows me that there are some that are definitely out there and maybe savable, quote unquote, to where if they have a mental episode or something, and maybe they can claim insanity in court, those people
yeah,
could be cured or helped at least, right?
yeah. Well, there, for example, we can compare and contrast, let's say, two New York state-based serial killers in the 1990s. There was a guy by the name of Joel Rifkin, who killed 17 young women, combination of sex workers and runaways. And unfortunately, the most at-risk folks in our society are oftentimes prey for serial killers because they're just readily available and they're estranged from their families and they're on the street, and it makes for easy targets for serial killers. And so Joel Rifkin, preyed on these individuals, and he is a complete psychopath and narcissist. He's been locked up for a while now, but he sleeps like a baby at night because nothing bothers him. He just did what he thinks he was born to do, supposed to do. Now compare and contrast that with a serial killer also from the same era named Robert Schulman, who was killing women in the 1990s. He killed five, I believe. I think it was five. But here, he was profoundly mentally ill and probably a paranoid schizophrenic with psychotic delusions. And he was compelled to do this, but he hated himself for it. He absolutely loathed himself. So that's a difference. That's a very much of a distinction. He regretted and had tremendous remorse for the fact that he just couldn't control this inside of himself. Whereas the Joel Rifkins and the BTKs, it's like, this is what I do. I love it, and no one's going to stop me, and I can sleep like a baby at night because it just doesn't bother me.
Man, I feel for that other guy. That second one, Joel, was it?
No, Joel Rifkin is the psychopath. Robert Schulman was the one who
Cool.
I believe was. He's now passed away. He died, and I wouldn't even I wouldn't be surprised if it was his own self-loathing and mental instability even that led to his ultimately his demise. But and so yeah, so the serial killers that are that off the rails in terms of mental illness tend not to be the prolific long-term serial killers because they're just incapable of sustaining it, and they're the ones that leave evidence behind, and they're not meticulous in covering their tracks and things like that. So and again, that's why the more prolific ones are the ones that do get away with it for a long time, the ones that desire notoriety, and as you said, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So we think that all serial killers are the Ted Bundys and the BTKs and the John Wayne Gacy's, when in fact they are the minority. They're just the minority that we know them know well.
Gotcha. But so I think that's one interesting thing I haven't really thought about, because we think of serial killers as these heartless and like soul empty people or husks of people, and they don't really care. But then you have Robert Schulman, who sits there and absolutely loathes himself, and
That's right.
uh, like it's weird because that brings about like some sense of humanity back into the whole thing, and it actually makes me feel for the guy, because that's
Yes.
got to be like an absolute hell of living like
Yeah, I
that.
was going to say it's like hell on earth. I mean, imagine being having this insatiable compulsion to kill, and yet you hate yourself for it. Yeah, I mean, I can't imagine anything that's so much more of a living hell. And I know one of the areas that you focus on is addiction, and I would I have used this analogy for a long time now, that for serial killers, particularly the Robert Schulmans, I mean, you could almost look at him as a self-destructive addict or alcoholic. He was just compelled to do it, and he hated what he was doing to himself and others around him, but he couldn't stop. But even those that don't have the emotional reaction to it, or the self-loathing, it's still very much in my mind like an addiction, because I've also spent quite a bit of time studying addiction and recovery, in my own work, and even in my own personal life. And you have these cycles, and no one described it to me better than not Jeffrey Dahmer, David Berkowitz, the son of Sam.
Hmm.
He explained this to me. He said the compulsion to kill would rise up, and it would become this insatiable hunger where he had to kill, and he would fantasize and fantasize about how glorious it was going to be. This was going to be his ultimate satisfaction. This would be finally the moment that would give him the satisfaction that he was hoping for his whole life. He would kill. There'd be the momentary high, but then there'd be a tremendous letdown. a
Mm.
tremendous letdown. And he said that the high of the kill never lived up to the fantasy of the kill. It never lived up to it. So he would go almost into a despair, into a valley, and then the hunger would start creeping up again, and he'd have to do it again. And it became this never ending cycle. I mean, that sounds a lot like addiction to me,
Uh-huh.
you know? And the high never sustains. It just never sustains. And you've got to have more and more and more. And a lot of times these individuals do escalate. They escalate either in terms of they truncate the time frame, that it's shorter and shorter periods of time in between the murders, or they up the risk factor somehow. They try to make
Mm.
it more thrilling in some way. I mean, that sounds quite a bit like addiction.
No, that really does. Because I myself was an alcoholic for a decade, and boy, was that rough. And I messed with other things, but alcohol was my thing. And so I know a bunch of other people that would be, once I was in rehab in the Minute Nehemiah in Dallas, they would talk about how they would go get clean for a few months or something, and they would just be like, no, just one more. And like you said, it was never enough. It was never that expectation. And for me, mine was more of an active, slow suicide of
Hmm.
sorts. And but that was the thing too, is that I hated myself for it. And uh, but that cycle of like, all right, time to get to the next high, and then expectations. It seems like no matter what we do in life, nothing ever lives up to the expectation. It's always a little bit of a letdown, right? Uh,
That's right.
so it's sad that that even applies to the serial killers of the world.
Yeah, yeah, and that's why I said I really I began having this this it's a theoretical perspective. I mean, it's not every serial killer is going to agree with this, and even David Berkowitz didn't really like the analogy when I told him that it sounded very much like alcoholism or drug addiction. He didn't like that because in his mind he buys into the notion that that's a weakness and that it's a moral failing, right? And he didn't like that.
Mm-hmm.
He didn't like it, even though it might apply and it might actually help to explain it in a very effective way. He
Mm-hmm.
simply didn't like it because of the baggage that goes along with that in our society, that you must have somehow be morally weak and so forth.
Yeah, I mean, you take out the actual substances, you take out the people, you take out uh, the time periods and stuff, and you just have that cycle. That sounds exactly like addiction. And
Exactly,
so,
exactly. But isn't it funny? Or if funny is not the right word. Ironic that even Berkowitz, a serial killer himself, didn't like that analogy applied to him because he buys into this notion of moral weakness, that you should somehow just pull yourself up by your bootstraps and stop drinking or stop doing drugs. What's wrong with you? You just grow up, young man. And so he didn't like that analogy. And in fact, if you know the lore of David Berkowitz, it is that he was obsessed with Satan, and he was killing at the behest of Satan. And he likes that better because somehow that made him feel strong, and that it was beyond his control because Satan was doing it, and that's better than being morally weak. You know what I'm saying?
mm-hmm.
It's kind of ironic, how he himself was believing the social norms of all of this.
Yeah, that almost sounds like he was using that as his escape route of saying like, look, that's not me. That's on Satan, the big guy.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. The devil made me do it.
Yeah,
Yeah, the devil made me do it.
that sounds a lot like addicts and alcoholics too. Just like, no, that wasn't me. Sometimes they go, I am sick, and I mean, at least they owned up to it. So, um,
Mhm.
that actually leads me to a really curious question. What have you noticed about like spirituality or religion and serial killers and stuff like that?
Wow. Well, I mean, that leads me right to, I'm going to tell you an incredible story. some of them, just like some criminals, they find religion, oftentimes, behind bars. Well, you can't get much more extreme than the son of Sam, David Berkowitz. So he was arrested in 1977,
Mm-hmm.
and he was only 24 years old at the time, and he truly believed, and he told the world that he was Satan's disciple, and that Satan was compelling him to kill. Now, a couple of years went by after he was given multiple life sentences, and he was sent to Attica initially, Attica State Prison in New York, which is a pretty scary place.
Mm.
There was actually a murder attempt on his life. They tried to kill him while he was there. But for the first couple of years, he maintained this belief system that Satan was going to come and open the front door of prison and just let him out. Why wouldn't he? I've done Satan's good work, so why wouldn't he, come and save me?
Mm-hmm.
Well, then 10 years went by, and he slowly, over time, came to realize, well, I guess this is not going to happen. And over time, he became depressed, clinically depressed. He became despondent. He ultimately became self-loathing and ultimately suicidal. Okay, now we're up to 1986. And I'm going to tell you the story the way he told it to me. And this is where this whole thing becomes a little bit like Ripley's Believe It or Not. But Berkowitz sat with me and he told me, he said, in 1986, God entered my cell as I was about to hang myself with a bed sheet in my prison cell. And God touched me. And in that moment, I was washed clean of all my sins and transgressions and everything. And he transformed me, these are his words, from the son of Sam serial killer into the son of hope, minister and evangelist for God, an apostle, basically an apostle for God. This is his own description.
Uh-huh.
Now, a lot of people scoff at that, a lot of people, roll their eyes, and so forth. But this is absolutely true. He has been embraced by the evangelical Christian community in the world. They operate a website on his behalf. It's called Arise. It's ariseandshine.org. You can check it out. Hundreds of thousands of people from around the world have been flocked to this website that's managed for him by the evangelical community.
Huh.
And people flock to it who are looking for hope and looking for redemption and a message of inspiration. And Berkowitz, to this day, this all started in 1986 in prison. It's now 2024. He's still corresponding with thousands of people every year on an old-fashioned typewriter because he's not allowed email. So he uses a typewriter.
Wow.
And he invited me to spend a day with him in prison, in his maximum security prison in upstate New York. And I am telling you, it was an experience like I could not believe. When I got there, it's first of all, it's like a fortress prison because it's only lifers and people, people committed horrible acts and murder. And so it's a really scary looking place. It's like Dracula's castle, up in the mountains. But when I got into, they took me to a cafeteria or like a commissary area to meet with him in a common room.
Mm-hmm.
And this common room is filled with vending machines. All right. But I was sitting there and I actually had a big bag of quarters with me because I was ready for the vending machines because the administrators told me if you feed him, he will talk all afternoon. So I thought, okay, I'll feed the guy, and we'll see what happens. Well, the door opened up, and I still had this mental image of this very scary, crazy-looking young man, who shot up New York City, and instead, this guy who's fairly short. And he's now balding and chubby, comes scampering into the room with a big old smile on his face and big red rosy cheeks. He kind of looked like one of the seven dwarves or like a backyard ceramic gnome, and he comes scampering across the floor and he gives me this big old serial killer hug, like if there is such a thing, and I'm like, holy shit, I didn't expect this, And then we sit down, and because he's a minister, so we said the Lord's Prayer, and then he starts eating. And I'm feeding quarters into the vending machines. He's eating hot dogs. He's eating hamburgers. He's eating all kinds of stuff. And I'm just like, this is absolutely amazing. And then he proceeds to eat 3 huge bags of Doritos Cool Ranch flavored chips. He designated I had to get that flavor, and he wanted 3, and he ate them all. And man, this guy, this is unbelievable. But then you may remember one of the things I mentioned to you is I started my career in advertising.
Uh-huh.
So I thought to myself, could there be an endorsement idea for Doritos here? The son of Sam says devilishly good chips. Hella good, right? I'm having these crazy thoughts, as I'm sitting there, and I was like, okay, back to reality. And then he goes on to tell me his life, right? And he starts and literally sobbing in front of me, crocodile tears about his transgressions and his remorse, wishing there was any way that he could undo the harm that he had done. But then it's like his countenance brightens, his eyes get all shining, and he still has tears, but now they're like tears of joy and hope and inspiration. And as he tells me about the work that he's doing with people all over the world, and I was sitting there, I was thinking, man, this guy, this is like an incredibly emotional moment here. And if he's an actor, he deserves an Academy Award, because he's like the Daniel Day-Lewis or Robert De Niro of serial killer actors, sitting here in front of me. But then, I have a sense of spirituality myself, and especially through my own recovery and things that I've gone through. So I'm thinking to myself, maybe this is true. Could this be true? I mean, maybe what I'm seeing has, this transformation is manifested in front of me, because I have a PhD, but it's certainly not in spiritual rebirth, So who am I to say, right?
Uh-huh.
But then of course the devil's advocate, on my shoulder, saying, he's full of it. He's got to be full, and what I came to believe, however, and this is kind of in the middle now, and most things in life are not the extremes. They're somewhere in the shade of gray and in the middle.
Mm-hmm.
And I truly believe, at the very least, he does believe this. I don't think he's acting. I don't think he's lying. I don't think that this is a game. I think it's very, very real for him in terms of this work that he's doing. And my feeling is, if he is having an influence and helping people around the world through his ministry, let him do it. But I think he should remain exactly where he is. He shot 13 people, killed 6, permanently disabled a number of others, and just terrified 8 million people for more than a year. And for that, he's right where he belongs. Let him stay right where he belongs. But I'm going to tell you, it was one of the most fascinating days, afternoons of my life that I spent in prison with him.
Wow, that is very interesting. Like, that's such a weird, interesting picture to see a serial killer come out as Seven Dwarf esque.
Yeah, I mean, he literally, imagine like one of those little ceramic backyard gnomes, or one of the 7 dwarves with rosy cheeks, and it's just like, oh my God. What happened to the son of Sam? Who's this gnome that's that's here now? And so I mean that is at least a physical transformation.
Yeah, I'm definitely going to have to read your book, as will everyone that is listening to this, because I mean, why do we love serial killers? We got to figure it out a little bit more.
I currently am touring the country with my show, and if you wouldn't allow me to, or if you would allow me to give a shout out. My website is docbonn.com, DOCBONN.com. And if you go to my website, there's a whole list of the entire tour, all the cities that are coming up, and links for tickets too, if you'd like to come. And of course, I would love it if you did. My next shows coming up are early August. I have August 4th in St. Louis, August 5th in Nashville, and August 6th in Atlanta. About 80% of the audience is women, regardless of where I go. I mean, I've done this show from Florida. I've done it to the state of Washington, and it's always about 80% women. And I think women in particular are drawn to understand these predators because it's sort of ingrained in our society. Women fear the unknown abductor, the intruder, tremendous fear of being abducted and violated and or killed, by this unknown intruder. And I have women tell me all the time they're looking for answers. They're looking for tools, ways to identify the next Ted Bundy, or BTK, so that as not to fall victim. And then in my shows, it becomes almost like a sisterhood over the course of the 90 minutes, and there's like this cathartic release of tension and anxiety. Again, I use some dark humor, and it's almost like they let that tension out, and by the end of the show it's become like this, almost like I said, like a sisterhood, among the group. So there's some men there too, but I would definitely say on average it's about 80% women, which, by the way, my friends in the programming community, podcasts and TV shows, like Investigation Discovery TV Network,
Uh-huh.
Oxygen TV Network, that's all true crime all the time. Same
Mm,
thing, 80% women.
that's crazy. And
Yep.
I guess it really does have to deal with survival. Uh,
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely, and empathy. We're empathetic creatures.
I really hope everyone that is listening finds your show and goes and attends it live, because I think everyone needs a little bit of a cathartic release on dark humor about serial killers. Because, I mean, I've learned a whole lot in this hour, and I mean, I just got so many more questions for you. And I think we just opened up Pandora's box.
Well, we'll have to do it again sometime. We'll have volume two.
Yes, sir. That sounds like a great idea to me. Um,
Okay.
well, that is unfortunately all the time that we do have. But hopefully we do see you again. Again, your website is docbond.com.
DOCBONN.com, Doc Bond.
All right. I'll make sure to plaster that everywhere that I can, and I'll tell my friends to check out your book. And I mean, most of my family's female, so I'm sure you're going to have a little bit of a spike in sales right there. So, all
Sounds good to me. Sounds good.
right, Dr. Scott Bond. Until we meet again.
All right. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed our discussion, and thanks for the invite.
Thank you again. Stay safe. What is that one blessing? May the wind always be at your back and the sun always rise in front of you. So,
Like, likewise.
thank you. You have a good night, sir.
Okay. Bye bye.